In the late 1990s, two developments of great significance took place. In 1997, the team at JP Morgan developed a complex derivative instrument, first known as Bistro. It stood for something which is unimportant. It's an acronym. This instrument allowed investment banks to insure themselves against default of their corporate loans. As the problem of loan default was at the heart of the banking business, Bistro was a potentially revolutionary development in its history, they thought. One of the team who worked on it likened it to the Manhattan Project, which had produced the atomic bomb. The metaphor was more apt than he realised. Not long after, these instruments became known as collateralised debt obligations, or, as I will call them from now on, CDOs. In 1999, an even more portentous development took place. Those producing CDOs turned their gaze to the booming US housing market. For many years, home mortgages had been turned into securities. These securities were now in turn transformed into CDOs. Like the corporate loans-based CDOs, mortgage-based CDOs were divided into what were called tranches. I'm sorry this is technical, but I've made it as simple as I can. I've struggled for months even to understand it myself, but it's sort of important in the story. Junior, mezzanine, senior, and the supposedly safer-than-safe super senior. A very high proportion of these mortgage-based CDOs derived from the most rapidly expanding part of the mortgage market, known in a delightful euphemism as subprime, where clients with no assets and insecure employment prospects were encouraged by mortgage companies to take out very expensive loans, which often began with deceptive early so-called teaser rates. Eventually, the subprime mortgages were issued mainly for the purpose of satisfying the insatiable demand of Wall Street's major banks and brokerages for material they could transform into ultra-lucrative CDOs. The pace at which these CDOs were created was frenzied. In this frenzy, the cooperation of the major rating agencies was required. Almost as a matter of course, they turned BBB-rated securities into AAA-rated CDOs. AAA rating is very unusual in these circles. Not all governments have it. An incredulous trader who was convinced that this market was certain eventually to implode and who built his business by shorting these CDOs, that is, by betting on their failure, continually asked himself the overwhelming question: can this rating agency fraud really be legal, really allowed? It was. By providing bundles of vulnerable subprime mortgages with AAA ratings, the key agencies turned a handy profit both for themselves and for the companies whose products they were supposedly rating. To call this a conflict of interest seems altogether too kind. In turn, these products were sold on to big investors like governments or pension funds, which were looking for high returns at a time when the Fed was keeping interest rates extremely low. One of the key issues faced by the banks and the brokerages in the creation of these CDOs was the problem of deciding the number to be used for the statistical correlation of a general default. Because the information used to assess the mortgage-based CDOs all came from the time of the housing market boom, the banks and brokerages decided to use a very low number. This turned out to be a serious mistake. Mathematics seemed to show a generalised default on subprime mortgages was virtually impossible, something that common sense would not have shown. The mathematics, however, was based on systematically misleading data. This was not a minor matter. If the subprime mortgage market was ever to suffer a general collapse, especially one large enough to reach the super senior pool, something Gillian Tett has shown, all those banks, brokerages and insurance companies which were massively involved in the trade would be in desperate trouble. But not only they would be. If this happened, the whole world economy would be in desperate trouble. Now, as we know, in 2007, the housing bubble began to burst. Vast numbers of subprime mortgages defaulted. Wall Street was now indeed in trouble. By March 2008, Bear Stearns was effectively bankrupt. It was bought for a song by JP Morgan Chase. By September 2008, the final crisis, as we all know, came. The massive semi-public mortgage businesses, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, were effectively now nationalised. More fatefully, Lehman Brothers was allowed to fail by the US Treasury Secretary, Hank Paulson, for standard, what is always called moral hazard reasons. That is, if you don't allow someone to fail, the incentive for behaving well diminishes or goes. When Lehman Brothers was allowed to fail, in the United States and beyond, the financial markets now froze in fear. Not only the giants of Wall Street, but also many of the largest banks outside the US, like Deutsche Bank, the Royal Bank of Scotland, were up to their necks in the derivatives trade. The banks were no longer willing to lend to each other. They knew each other's dirty secrets. The Bush administration asked Congress now for $700 billion to buy up the toxic assets of those banks and brokerages regarded as too big to fail. The insurance company AIG, the largest in the world, which had a staggering $650 billion super senior CDO liability, was now bailed out with an initial $50 billion loan from the Federal Reserve. As everyone knew, its collapse would have taken a large part of the world's economy with it. The British government now injected £25 billion into its banking system. The Irish government guaranteed all its banks' deposits. Iceland was forced to nationalise all its banks. The mad trade in derivatives, which had earned massive fortunes for the Wall Street masters of the universe, had by now brought the entire world economy to its knees. The market faith was at the heart of that was at the heart of neoliberalism was deeply implicated in this catastrophe. Two outstanding recent books make this clear. Gillian Tett, in Fool's Gold, has shown that many of those responsible for the architecture of the most complicated financial instruments were fervent disciples of Hayek. I quote from her, "If there was one thing that united swaps traders, it was the belief in the efficiency and superiority of free markets." End quote. By a different route, Justin Fox, in a very recent book called The Myth of the Rational Market, has shown that on the eve of the derivatives meltdown, abstruse economic theories about the perfect rationality of the market, the stock market in particular, had turned into an ideology that infected the thinking of both Wall Street traders and the US financial elite. Fox describes the ideology like this, I quote, "Financial markets knew best. They moved capital from those who had it to those who needed it. They spread risk. They gathered and dispersed information. They regulated global affairs with a swiftness and decisiveness that governments couldn't match." From time to time, practical men of affairs had warned about the dangers of derivatives. Alan Taylor of the Royal Bank of Canada called them a time bomb. The famous financier Felix Rohatyn called them, I quote, "financial hydrogen bombs built on personal computers by 26-year-olds with MBAs. Most famously, Warren Buffett argued in 2002, derivatives are financial weapons of mass destruction, carrying dangers that, while now latent, are potentially lethal. As we have seen, members of the Congress or administrators like Brooksley Bourne had argued the case for derivative market regulation, but time and again the warnings of the Cassandras had been rebuffed, both by finance industry lobbyists and by the neoliberal true believers. Undoubtedly, the most important individual example of one of these true believers was the head of the Federal Reserve, in some ways the most important economic figure of the neoliberal era, Alan Greenspan. Consistently from the mid-1990s to 2008, Greenspan defended derivatives. He led the charge against Brooksley Bourne in 98. He favoured the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, and Greenspan had time and again offered a defence of the trade in derivatives on classic free market Hayekian grounds. On one occasion, for example, he argued, I quote, "I believe that the general growth in large institutions have occurred in the context of an underlying structure of markets in which many of the larger risks are dramatically, I should say, fully hedged." And on another, "What we have found over the years in the marketplace is that derivatives have been an extraordinarily useful vehicle to transfer risk from those who shouldn't be taking it to those who are willing to and are capable of doing so." According to Alan Blinder, or Blinder, I don't know how he pronounces it, a fellow member of the board of the Federal Reserve, I quote, "Proposals to bring even minimal regulation to the derivatives trade were basically rebuffed by Greenspan. He described Greenspan as consistently cheerleading on derivatives. In his extremely prescient 1998 attack on free market fundamentalism, in a book called False Dawn, which commented in passing on the risk of a systemic collapse of the world economy because of the practically unknowable virtual economy of financial derivatives, this is 1998, John Gray posed a very interesting question. The question was this: what cataclysm in the market will it take to convince Greenspan that a new era of stable growth is merely another myth? We now do know the answer to that question. With admirable honesty, Greenspan confessed in written testimony to Congress in October last year, 2008, that the derivatives implosion had left him in a state of what he called shocked disbelief. During his oral testimony, Henry Waxman asked him if his lifelong free market ideology had been shaken. With characteristic circumlocution, Greenspan replied, I quote, "I think I have found a flaw in the model that I perceived as the critically functioning structure that defines how the world works." What I think he meant by this was yes. Historians are experts in predicting the past. Indeed, I regard myself as such an expert. They are not so skilled at predicting the future. Nonetheless, I'll risk this. I think there are very good reasons for believing, like the Prime Minister, that with the derivatives disaster and the coming of the Great Recession, the time when neoliberalism provided our era's dominant common sense might be drawing to its end. And I want to suggest some major reasons for this belief. As I've argued, neoliberalism rested on a single leap of faith. Because markets were believed to be self-correcting, their operation did not require the intervention of governments. What was interesting to Mr. Rudd and also to me was that following the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers and the freezing of financial markets across the globe, virtually no one behaved as if they truly believed this to be true. At the moment of crisis, the CEOs of American banks, brokerages and insurance companies all looked to government for assistance and for leadership. It was Hank Paulson, formerly CEO of Goldman Sachs, a free market fundamentalist, if ever there was one, who drew up the initial plans for saving the financial system and bailing out the banks and brokerages regarded as too big to fail. It was governments across the globe which now injected capital into the banks, or which guaranteed their deposits, or which decided that there was no alternative to temporary nationalisation. And it was governments of the G20 who set about the arduous task of creating a new regulatory structure for the international financial system. In the face of crisis, everyone knew the market was completely powerless. If the banks and brokerages had been asked to rely on an invisible hand to sort out the unholy mess their involvement in the derivatives trade had created, the world economy would have passed into free fall. At the moment of truth, the idea central to the neoliberal faith, the superiority of market forces to economic intervention of government, was shown to be a myth, was shown and was known to be a myth by everyone that mattered. Almost everyone now recognised that in different circumstances, both market forces and government interventions had their place. Stiglitz summed up this best of all in the following words, I quote, "Most of the individual mistakes boil down to just one, a belief that markets are self-adjusting and that the role of government should be minimal. The embracing by America and much of the rest of the world of this flawed economic philosophy made it inevitable that we would eventually arrive at the place we are today." End quote. If the neoliberal era had begun with Ronald Reagan's witticism about government being the problem and not the solution, and if it had been entrenched when Bill Clinton observed that the era of big government was over, we might think of it coming to an end when Barack Obama argued at his inauguration that the real issue was really not whether government ought to be big or small, but whether what it did actually worked. The coming of the Great Recession also seemed to mark a sea change in the intellectual landscape. The neoliberal era had begun with the dethroning of Keynes, whose influence over a generation was held responsible, as we've seen, for the arrival of stagflation. Yet to judge by the behaviour in 2008 and 2009 of both governments and international institutions, it was as if that dethronement had never really taken place. Keynes had argued that the Great Depression might have been avoided if governments had responded in the 1930s, not by trying to balance their budgets, but by borrowing heavily and by stimulating demand. Across the globe, this is precisely what governments now did. Even the originally Keynesian International Monetary Fund, which neoliberals had taken possession of in the early 1980s, now suddenly seemed to return to its origins by urging governments across the globe to embark immediately on a $6 trillion spending program. It was as if Keynes had not been executed by the neoliberals, as was generally believed, but had merely gone into exile while waiting patiently for the kind of crisis that will allow him to make a triumphant return. With the coming of the Great Recession, the most persuasive economists were the small band of Keynesians, like the two Nobel Prize winners, Joseph Stiglitz and Paul Krugman. One of this band, James K. Galbraith, the son of the famous Galbraith, now joked that since the arrival of the Great Recession, he had moved from the margins to the mainstream without changing a single idea. Neoliberal economists and publicists were, of course, still arguing, here as well as in America, but hardly anyone was now listening, or hardly anyone who had economic power was still listening. The neoliberals had gained some of their influence by convincing non-economists among the political class that they represented the collective wisdom of the most successful discipline among the social sciences, economics. Not only was this proposition always somewhat doubtful, it also did not now much help their cause. Virtually no economist in the mainstream had predicted the coming crash. More deeply, mainstream economists had talked with confidence about the end of depression or recession economics and of the arrival of a new era of stable economic growth, which Greenspan's successor at the Fed, the very talented Ben Bernanke, had christened the Great Moderation. To put it mildly, this new era had not come to pass. Two eminent economists, George Akerlof and Robert Shiller, now published a book with the Keynesian title Animal Spirits, which cogently questioned the worth of a discipline whose fundamental assumption that human beings always behave rationally and on the basis of self-interest was so self-evidently false. It's a small and extremely important book. And from the grave, a minor Keynesian called Hyman Minsky, who had theorised about the wild speculative instability and Ponzi finance that long periods of unregulated financial stability would inevitably bring, was now hailed as a prophet of our present discontents. One central normative principle of the neoliberals, as I've tried to show, is that wealth and earnings resulting from lawful behaviour conducted in the marketplace must not be questioned, cannot be questioned. During the era of neoliberalism, this principle was surprisingly widely accepted. Let me give one example. After outlining the astonishing wealth and earnings of the American super-rich, which I outlined earlier in the lecture, even a liberal, a left liberal like Robert Reich, felt compelled before the recession, when he wrote, to remind his readers, I quote, that the super-rich are not at fault. By and large, the markets are generating these outlandish results. Now, it is easy to see how markets are genuinely responsible for the wealth of George Soros or Bill Gates or the Walmart family. But why we should believe that it is the impersonal logic of the market that has decided to award American CEOs several times what their European or Japanese equivalents earn, or to award bankers and brokers tens of millions of bonuses and stock options each year, or to take a different example, to award American physicians double the salary earned by other physicians in the OECD, is, to me at least, very far from clear. With the arrival of the Great Recession, finally, questions about wealth distribution on Wall Street and beyond were being asked by the general public. It's called populism when it comes up. And recently, it's interesting, a decision has been made by one of Obama's officials not to give evidence about who is getting financial aid in order to prevent populist outrage. The reason that wealth was being questioned, finally, was not the revelation of actions of uber criminals like Bernie Madoff, who stole $50 billion from his clients. Even if in its scale such behaviour is unprecedented, this type of behaviour is only too familiar to us. The reason that Wall Street wealth was being questioned was rather that the eyes of the general public were finally opened to the astonishing sense of entitlement to riches beyond imagining that the most respectable of the bankers and brokers had revealed. These bankers and brokers had made incalculably vast fortunes as a result of their involvement in the derivatives industry. In the year Wall Street imploded, they awarded themselves $33 billion in bonuses. Even after the trade collapsed, taking with it a goodly part of the world's economy, they continued to regard their bonuses as no more than their just desserts. I'll give you one astonishing example. The single most disastrous business implicated in the derivatives trade was AIG Financial Services in London, a small branch of the larger AIG business. This small office was largely responsible for the collapse of its parent, which eventually required $152 billion taxpayer dollars to bail it out. After the AIG bailout, the 400 employees of the London branch received on average a bonus of $1 million each. Its head, Joseph Cassano, who had done more than anyone else to destroy AIG, received a golden handshake of $34 million and was put on a consultation contract of $1 million a month. Goldman Sachs received $13 billion of the money given by US taxpayers to AIG because AIG owed it. In July this year, Goldman Sachs laid aside for its employees a bonus fund of $20 billion. As one commentator has pointed out, I quote, "This is the sum the G8 allocates annually to combating hunger in the world." This kind of behaviour, implicitly at least, receives the blessing of a philosophy that regards market outcomes as impersonal and morally neutral, and that portrays the quest for social justice as a dangerous mirage and as a way station on the road to serfdom. Moreover, it has occurred in a country that has told its poorest 47 million people that the provision of basic health insurance to all citizens is well beyond its means. The Obama administration is now struggling to increase the marginal tax rate of the super rich and to introduce a decent health system for the poor. The battle being fought is weird and fierce. I was fixated by American television in my recent visit. Rupert Murdoch's despicable Fox News is hyperventilating over health reform. One of the most influential members of the Republican Party, Sarah Palin, recently accused Obama of planning to establish death panels to kill off elderly Americans. Another, Rush Limbaugh, went even further, likening Barack Obama's health reform program to Adolf Hitler's National Socialism. Even if Limbaugh does not understand it, the academic scribbler ultimately responsible for this insane thought is Friedrich Hayek. If the era of Keynesian social democratic consensus might be thought to have begun when a mile-long queue formed in London late in the Second World War of people wanting to purchase a copy of the Beveridge Report, the blueprint for the British welfare state, the introduction of a decent healthcare system in the United States, if it should ever come to pass, would create a fitting symbol to mark the beginning of the end of the neoliberal era. I believe it is most likely that the era of neoliberalism is indeed drawing to its close. Just as stagflation broke the Keynesian social democratic consensus, so is it likely that the coming of the Great Recession will eventually wash away the idea at the heart of neoliberalism, the magic of the market. This, of course, will not happen overnight. It is well to remember that there was a 5-year gap between the arrival of stagflation and the election of the Thatcher government. But it is also well to remember that there are two important differences between the circumstances surrounding the end of the Keynesian era and the present unravelling of neoliberalism. When the Keynesian consensus collapsed, a party in waiting existed, ready to seize their chance. No equivalent anti-neoliberal party exists today. Old-style socialism is well and truly dead. Left-of-centre neo-Keynesians are far less ideological, far more divided, far more moderate and cautious than their neoliberal equivalents once were 30 years ago. Even more importantly, at the moment of the neoliberal collapse, humanity has become acutely aware of the existence of a new kind of threat, impending environmental catastrophe through human-induced climate change. Those who inherit the post-neoliberal world are obliged not merely to strive to reconcile the ambition of a renewed prosperity with the quest for domestic and global social justice. They are also obliged to reconcile both these ambitions with an altogether more immediate and far more daunting common task, the struggle to renounce the use of fossil fuels in order to save the earth. Although no one yet knows what the era we are entering will look like, or what it will eventually be called, one thing at least seems to me reasonably clear. The collapse of market fundamentalism will allow us to focus our attention, without the distraction of false ideology, on the kinds of economic, ethical and environmental questions which 30 years of neoliberalism have helped us to evade. To me at least, that fact at least affords us all some reasonable grounds for hope. Thank you very much.